Hello, hello. Welcome back to the Agile track. It's really good to see some familiar faces from earlier talks in the Agile track. If you like this talk, I'd encourage you to check out others in the Agile track. I'd also encourage you to use your mobile apps and leave ratings and reviews for speakers. It's really, really helpful for them. I'm Max. People seem to think of me as the Agile guy at Atlassian, which is kind of funny to me because I feel like I'm more the Agile front end. And for questions that I don't know, I go to Ian, who's my Agile back end. Answering these questions about difference between cycle time and lead time is not in Ian's job description. Neither is giving awesome talks like this. So Ian, thank you so much for being here. And with that, let's welcome Ian Buchanan.
Thanks, Max. Great. So a lot of this is my story. I'll be sharing a lot of insights that I had over my career. But I think kind of logically this begins about a year ago in the sense that last year Atlassian engaged with the Agile community to hold a kind of retrospective on Agile. And that got me thinking about some of the, some of the gaps and weaknesses that I had started to see over my career. So anyway, we'll dive in a little bit. I want to point out that this is a love story of Agile, at least to the extent that the Castaway movie was also a love story. Now, I'm not sure if everybody in the room has seen the movie. Tom Hanks's character gets stranded on an island, and he writes these love letters to his wife. But by the end of the movie, we kind of know, it's maybe kind of obvious for how long he's stuck there. But eventually he comes back to reality, and his wife has had to move on. And so it's not necessarily a happy ending. So I kind of want to say that about this presentation as well. But this is also a story about making sense. So as I tell my story, I'm going to be putting it into a context that I wish I had known at the time of each of these events. So I'll be drawing on a framework created in 1999 by Dave Snowden, and it's called Cynefin. That's a Welsh word, and I've hided here in its definition this word places, because I want us to kind of come to an understanding of what the intent is. That places where we live, usually we think of like a house or maybe the island that Tom Hanks was stranded on as a habitat, as somewhere we live. But within those constructs, within the island, there's the cave that he lived in, or the mountaintop that he would look out from, or the ocean. And all of those have to do with the kind of places that he lived in. In our world, if we live at home, we live in a bedroom and a kitchen and a living room, but we also go to a corner office, a corner cafe, or we go to an office, and all of those, even if they are not in one spot, are the places where we live. And I say that because the Cynefin model talks about these problem domains, that there's this universe of problems that people have to deal with. Now, Cynefin has become popular in Agile and DevOps circles, mostly because it helps justify the kind of thinking behind Agile. But I don't know, on one of the plane rides heading in this direction, I saw the Vice movie, and Don Rumsfeld comes up. So one of the most famous uses of Cynefin is when Rumsfeld said, there are known unknowns versus unknown unknowns. So I see some people who remember that reference, but we'll get there. Let me try to explain as I go. Okay, so if there are all those problem domains, when I began working in software in the late 90s, I was working on an e-learning product. So there was a team of outsourced developers that I had to communicate with in India. And by my guess, it was probably everybody's first software project. Now, it wasn't the first time that I had written software, but it was the first time that I had worked with a team to do that. Specification and design amounted to writing some PowerPoints and sending them over to the team in India. And the code we got back was probably just as good. So from my office in San Diego, I could really only collaborate with that team in some narrow window between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. before I got really too tired to do anything and needed to go home. So that was just really painful when we first got to the first release that we wanted to put out into some customers' hands We needed to install it on premise, and it just took weeks of back and forth to really understand how to get everything working. So just like that, although I had no other experience to compare that to, I just knew in my gut that that whole experience was the wrong way of building software. So show of hands, how many of you have been on a software project like that? All right, lots of good, honest folks in the room. So keep your hands up if that also drove you to Google for software best practices, because that's what it did for me. But what I didn't know at the time was how that term best practice fits with software. Software is a great way to capture a best practice, as we were doing with our software. The software itself is really little more than a kind of choose-your-own-adventure through some financial training. And it's the kind of thing that we saw implemented in the early days of the web, because the simple hypermedia techniques made it really possible to do self-guided, well, anything, self-guided training in this example. That's because the user can categorize, as in a key word in this Cynefin framework, they can categorize what they're looking for themselves, and the software responds. The software itself may have been simple in this sense, but that doesn't mean that the software project was simple. Well, we needed degrees of freedom, not in the content or the paths through the software itself, but in how the product would be installed, configured, and maintained, and then later in how it would be enhanced by subject matter experts over time. Now, I don't know if, maybe not everybody lived through these early e-learning days. In time, the market actually would solve for these constraints with standards like SCORM, would provide e-learning software. And today, pretty much anybody can go to sites like lynda.com and get access to a whole range of e-learning content. But none of that existed at the time, so we had to build it. So before we move on with my story, let's consider some synonyms. Now, when I talk about a practice, I'm talking about a way of doing something. The term practice asserts a way of doing something that's like a habit. So we're going to repeat it often enough, we can call it a practice. And I think you can just as easily talk about that as a method. Its only distinction comes to mind in maybe the amount of repetition. Like maybe it's a method the first time you do it. Like if you follow a recipe, well, somebody has practiced it, just not you, right? So I realize that some people like method better than practice here, but both capture enough of what I'm trying to communicate. For that matter, I think the word process fits here too, as a systematic series of actions directed to some end. Atlassian has started to publish some of the ways that we work, and we look for activities that have become common patterns inside of our organization. I think we avoided the traditional terms as much to sound different as to be a little bit more resonant with our own values. One of our values is play as a team. And I think this game-oriented metaphor also brings something else to the table. It really kind of puts things into a different context so that it's clearer why there are multiple ways to achieve the same goal. So it's not necessary that we, I think there's kind of an implicit assumption in many people's minds that for practice and method and process as kind of prescriptions, that they also indicate the one best way to do something. And I think that's not necessarily true. Okay, so moving on back to my story, my next job was at a company called TogetherSoft. This puts me right into the age of object-oriented programming and into the community that was thinking about a kind of different way of solving things. So this was the world of OOAD, UML, the unified process, and kind of tied to the unified process, the idea of rep. At the time, that really scratched that itch that I had from that first project. It answered some of those significant questions about the way that we could have done that project better. With a formal approach to analysis and design, we really would have revealed some problems sooner, and we would have answered some of those problems that we discovered later more upfront. And we would have built a product that was easier to enhance when new content came along later. So analysis depends on history and experience. The age of OO was characterized by domination of architects, experts who might apply different techniques, but would pretty much converge on the same result in the end, high-performing software. Now, there are still some constraints, but this simple cause and effect relationship that we talk about for the simple domain is replaced more by high correlation and these exceptions that prove the rule. So I think now, if we kind of jump back to the present tense, we're just getting to software that works well in this domain with artificial intelligence and machine learning. But whether we talk about software that can capture the complicated domain, I think we still need to ask ourselves, but is a software project itself complicated? Is good analysis enough to make software projects really successful? So I'd like to try a thought experiment that I learned from an Agile conference. Imagine you get to the end of your software project or the end of a sprint, and just like the waves that keep knocking Tom Hanks back onto his deserted island, let's assume that we have been reset to 0. All of a sudden, all of the source code that we wrote has disappeared. So let's do, by a show of hands, who thinks that it would take the exact same amount of time, 100% of the time, to rewrite the source code from that we just lost? No hands. 75%. Oh, somebody, okay, 50%. All right, and 25%? Okay, so 50% is pretty common. And although I've never run this experiment in the real world, I mean, who would? I do find that when I run this thought experiment with other people, that 50% mark, there's something kind of magical about it. But that leaves us with a dilemma. Well, what is it that has happened in the other 50% of the time? You know, where did that time go? We were writing source code, and only 50% of that time it took to really write that code. Well, I think the best way to explain it is as learning. And I think that means that's another justification why we're in, you know, we can't really call that in the complicated domain. That's not the same as analysis. Okay, so although I was neck deep in object-oriented at TogetherSoft, TogetherSoft also had a foot in Agile. Even as RUP loomed large as the alternative to Agile, I was working with teams embracing feature-driven development and extreme programming. Scrum hadn't really won the war of the frameworks yet, so I got to see a lot of early Agile successes with a lot of variety. Now, at the time, what resonated most about Agile was expressed at the very start of the manifesto. It goes, we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others to do it. For me, that says two things. First, it's a real appeal to empiricism, not just for the industry, but for every team. It says we should all arrive at how to build software through a process of discovery and experimentation, not focusing on a set of universal best practices. In Cynefin terms, to me, it justifies that software is not in the simple or complicated domain. Second, it's a specific scoping. It's about software. Now, that's a contrast to traditional generalized project management, where the principles, maybe, you know, I'm not saying that the general principles of project management aren't true, but perhaps that they are sort of collapsed in upon themselves or simplified. So, for example, in the PMBOK world, there is a notion of schedule management. And perhaps that area and the area of cost management are really kind of squeezed together, because for all practical purposes on a software project, the cost is the time of people. So perhaps it's a bit like how physicists predict 11 dimensions, but in the practical world, we really only need 4. So even though it was about 2 years of working at TogetherSoft, after that we were acquired by Borland. And there's an interesting footnote in the Agile history about Borland. They were Agile back in 1993. And that's before the term was even coined, but there was a kind of complete set of Agile practices with iterations, integrations of team functions like planning, development, testing, and support, and an adaptive practice of introspection. Kind of rhymes with something we know from the Agile world. So despite that history, when I arrived, Borland was anything but Agile. And I really wished I had recognized the significance of this fact. If Agile was so great, how come we had abandoned it? But that's a hard question to ask of the true believer that I was at the time. And blind to that thought, I began to push for Agile inside Borland and helped to lead a successful Agile transformation. It really wasn't hard to convince the management at the time that something needed to change. We were on a schedule of annual releases that were slipping by months. And not only that, when we finally would deliver a release, it was often disappointing to our customers because we had made promises at user conferences like this and then just simply didn't deliver them. So what happened as we made our Agile transformation happen is we joined some of the ideas of Scrum with extreme programming, a little sprinkle of CMMI over the top, and began to create something called Borland Agile. We were setting more realistic expectations with customers through that process, and we stopped disappointing them, and we got to quarterly releases without slipping. And I think we were doing some truly innovative things at the time. But suddenly, and surprising to all of us leading the Borland Agile, this transformation, executives declared mission accomplished. The transformation was over and we had won. And just as suddenly, all the important practices of improvement stopped too. So no more rollout of new practices that we were learning in pockets of the company or from our customers. No more assessments and coaching from the team leading that transformation. And worst of all, no more retrospectives. In marketing, we still said we were Agile, but the reality was really something else. Now, I left Borland not long after, and the company sold itself to Micro Focus in a matter of weeks, which really probably explained the sudden shift. When the goal had become selling the company, it no longer needed the customer focus that Agile brought. In fact, that was probably just overhead that couldn't be reconciled on the books. Now, even today, I find it interesting, the Agile community is really trying to kind of find reasons, or I almost say excuses for these kinds of failures. So there's quite a lot of discussion about things like dark Scrum or cargo culting, but dismissing this failure is something that I find kind of deeply unsatisfying. If you can't explain why Agile fails, then I think you're missing some way to explain what Agile is and how it works. So I'll come back to that thought. So I think Agile fits very much with this complex domain from Kinevin. Now, you'll hear the term loosely coupled in context of modern microservices, but it also makes sense on an Agile team level, where teams are self-organizing, they're trying to break dependencies across teams by folding all of the important functions into one team. Now, Conway's law suggests these teams, if they have broken those kinds of dependencies, they should already be building loosely coupled systems. So all the hype about microservices is less about specific technology choices than it is about building the right kinds of team structures that create better system architectures. The thing is, the idea of loose coupling also means backing further away from simple cause and effect. There are no laws, there are only preferences and propensities. So this is the domain of known unknowns, where we can only deduce cause and effect relationships in retrospect. Now, there's an idea here, this enabling constraints, and I think Agile really demonstrates this really well. If we consider this Scrum sprint length, whether it's 2 weeks or 4 weeks, or like the whole month, it doesn't really matter. The time box is itself a constraint. And it enables, because the rule is that within the sprint, the priorities don't change. And as a constraint, the time box drives smaller batches. And then, of course, again, as an enabler, it lets the product owner change all the uncommitted work as often as is needed. So I think that last term here, emergent practice, is what makes Agile and DevOps so hard to define. We throw out terms like iterative and incremental, or inspect and adapt, but those people who have never participated in a process that works that way often find that a kind of meaningless appeal. And one might say, there are no right answers. So let me circle back now to method. Earlier I explained how this term is equivalent to practice or process as a way of doing something. And I've explained that Atlassian has taken to using the term play as a subtle contrast. So there's also considerable confusion in the Agile community about the terms method versus methodology. Now, the Agile Manifesto is a collection of values and principles. It was written by people who were practicing different ways of getting those things done, like extreme programming, DSDM, FDD, and of course Scrum. And as far as I can tell, the Agile Manifesto is effectively a result of combining those different ways of doing software development into one unified way of seeing software development. So I think the term method applies to XP, DSDM, FDD, and Scrum, and the term methodology applies to Agile. Unfortunately, the Agile community, seems to have gotten into a bit of a hair-splitting context. They think the terms like process and method and practice all just sound too much like prescription. So that you can't follow Scrum word for word like a recipe and expect great software. Okay, that makes sense. But I think the industry wants to make sure people understand that they must bring their own expertise and fit what is written into real-world context. But I think that means the Agile community, has decided that methods can't be adaptive. And on that point, I have to disagree. Further, I think the community seems to conflate method and methodology, as if methodology is just a more formal term. For example, the Wikipedia article on Scrum quotes Jim Highsmith, one of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto. And it talks about Agile methodologies in reference to XP and Scrum. So like the adaptive argument, I think the community seems to believe that methodology is something that you take as a starting point and tailor to specific needs. But again, I disagree. I think Scrum is a method, Agile is a methodology. And I bring up this argument for an important reason. This talk is about methodology. What I'm talking about here is like how we study the way that people work. So there's a bit of flaw in Agile, and that starts with an appeal to empiricism, but I'm sure it wants to have these better ways of working, mostly through adaptive methods. But I'm not sure that the appeal to empiricism is all the way followed through. Okay, so with that in mind, back to my story for a moment. After the years at Borland, I went into consulting, and I found a gig to write a Jira plugin. It's my first run-in with the Atlassian community as a whole. I had to install and configure all of the Atlassian products, so I took the time to do Atlassian's Dragon Slayer challenge. Has anybody else finished this and won the t-shirt? Oh yes, good, I see some other Dragon Slayers in the room. So somehow, like that outsourcing experience, I had felt like something was deeply wrong with this experience. There were so many places in configuration that I had to copy and paste something that I had just done to some other place. It was an affront to the programmer in me who was thinking about the DRY principle. Don't repeat yourself. Now that problem led me to a new breed of configuration management tools like Chef and Puppet, and into the movement called DevOps. Now, DevOps doesn't have a manifesto. Probably the Phoenix Project and DevOps Handbook amount to the DevOps canon. But one thing DevOps has that Agile doesn't is the State of DevOps report. The State of DevOps report embraces some really good research methods. It connects good practices to team culture in the ways that the Agile community only talks about through analogies and anecdotes. And it connects culture to the whole organizational performance. The sense of, are we meeting our business goals? So in this sense, I think it follows through on that promise of empirically improving software development. But it also goes beyond we are software developers. So here's the connection that it makes. In the left, we see some very specific technical practices. In the middle, we see some of the cultural elements. And on the right side, we see the connection that it makes all the way to organizational performance. I hope you'll read the report at some time. One of the most interesting contrasts from the State of DevOps report is between functional outsourcing, like the functions of development, testing, and operations, and this idea of lean product management. Of course, the Agile community recognizes these ideas pretty quickly. I mean, customer collaboration over contract negotiation is straight from the Agile Manifesto. But these ideas have been slow to manifest outside of the border of software development teams in IT operations, where outsourcing is still unfortunately quite common, and so are the cultural consequences. For that matter, beyond IT, there are still many business managers who would rather have a contract than an experiment. So I think the ultimate in lean product management is the lean startup. It's a book and a community that has emerged separate from DevOps, but it exemplifies the business implications. Eric Ries, the author of the main book in this community, draws heavily on Agile as the way to do the coding side of this. But his big idea is that it's not just about discovering which features a customer wants, but about discovering the whole business model. How will you market the product? How will you sell it? How will you build and enhance the product? How will you support it? What do you charge? Is it a one-time charge or a subscription? This build, measure, learn cycle is subtly different from Agile. Both are experimental, but the lean startup isn't just probing, it's acting. And that brings me to the chaotic domain. Here, it takes too long to understand what's happening to discover propensities or preferences, because when you know what has happened, it's already too late to do something about it. So for all practical purposes, cause is decoupled from effect. And that means there are no constraints. There's no amount of best practices, experience analysis, or experimental probing that's going to matter. You just have to make it up as you go. In this domain, a manager must establish order, sense where stability lies, and respond to turn the chaotic into the complex. So, is that the chaotic domain? Does that mean that's what I'm talking about in terms of what's after Agile? No, I think it's more about this view from above. It's what happens when we collectively understand that we're dealing with all of these domains. Now, Dave Snowden wrote a kind of all-at-once example. He uses an unfortunately tragic incident of the 1993 Brown's Chicken Massacre. There were several robbers who robbed this chicken place. Unfortunately, 7 employees were murdered. But as the situation evolved, the local police deputy chief had to act immediately to stem the panic. So that's the chaotic domain. While keeping the department running, that's the simple domain. While calling in experts, that's the complicated domain. And maintaining community confidence in the following weeks, that's the complex domain. So all of those in one event. I think the reality is that we're too often down inside the area of this model known as the disorder domain. That's where we're treating software development as if it were simple or complicated, but it's actually something on the left side, complex or chaotic. Conversely, when we treat our business domains as if they were always the same, we have the same kinds of problems. So I think there's a kind of interesting example here with like the lean startup. If you're in an organization that isn't going to change or adopt your business model, there's really no point in adopting the lean startup. So no, what I think is after Agile is really getting out of disorder. What domain are you in now? And then using that to make sense appropriately, and then moving around the framework. So let's talk about that moving around a little bit. Back to my story, I've been on Atlassian for about 4.5 years now. And what I've always admired about Atlassian from the outside is how much it's a kind of paragon of the Agile community. I've always held that quite dear. But when I joined, I discovered some big surprises. For one, inside of Atlassian, we talk very little about Agile. And maybe that's in the same way that Netflix, inside of Netflix, talks very little about DevOps. Sure, Atlassians go to Agile conferences and events. We're here talking with an Agile track. We're happy to learn things from the Agile community. Heck, even Mike and Scott began in the Sydney community, in the extreme programming community. And those values here, the ones that we embrace as our company values, sure speak of collaboration, adaptability, and self-organization. No, it's really more than we just don't need to evaluate things on a scale of Agile. We don't need to understand, can we do that because it's Agile or because it's not? There's only whether it helps us deliver customer value, and we're happy to learn things from our customers or the new ITIL 4, or the DevOps community, or from our own experiments in 20% time and in ship-its. So that leads me to another surprise. We also embrace the ideas of self-direction and self-organization. And I think we do so deeply that we rarely feel the need to ask different teams to act in just one way. That's why I get a funny look on my face when people ask me, well, how do you do things at Atlassian? I suppose I could just fall back on the very disappointing answer, it depends. But why does it depend? Well, Atlassian has built a kind of market-disrupting business model. Our founders started with a premise that great products can and should sell themselves. Our model focuses on quick and efficient acquisition of customers at scale. We build great products sold at a low price, and then service a large volume. And to do that, we built a website to help support that with online sales. And in order to sell online, we removed friction in transparent terms and pricing, and made it simple to have trials on your own. So for competitors who had assumed they had solved a simple problem with a traditional sales process, we have thrown them into the chaotic domain. So Dave Snowden's model highlights something subtle about this idea of disruption. There's this kind of wrinkle on the model itself that indicates it's really easy to fall off the cliff of simplicity with complacency. And then once you're over that cliff, you have to round the bases. You have to come around from chaotic to complex, complicated, and back to simple again. So the good direction is getting out of the chaotic quickly. It means moving through complex, over to complicated, and pushing into simple. And it's the natural inclination of companies and human organizations to drive in this direction. When we move from the left side to the right side, we move from unconstrained and loosely constrained domains into tightly constrained or no degrees of freedom. But in your business, you might understand this as just predictability. Furthermore, when we move around from chaotic to simple, we unlock the potential for human information tools, like the software to enable or even completely automate work. In your business, you might call this productivity. So I want to kind of extend that model with those two ideas, the disruption and history. They lead to some dangerous extremes. So let's consider two things most companies need to survive over time: efficiency and resiliency. Efficiency is how well an organization converts inputs like money or people's efforts into outputs like products and services that customers value. Resilience is how well a company can survive disruption. When there's a rapid change, can the company survive? Now, there's common wisdom in business about spreading risk around through diversification. But diversification, especially when achieved through merger and acquisition, comes with duplication and redundancy. As a result, high resiliency can come at the expense of efficiency, in which case a system, like your company, can be subject to internal collapse. So think about your own organization. How do org structures and processes affect day-to-day activities? Do they help get customers the value that they need efficiently? So that's why most organizations take a hard look at redundancy after M&A. Corporate business functions like accounting and legal are often the first to go. Some businesses take the opportunity to re-platform products so they can leverage common processes and org structures. But this can also go too far. Efficiency can break down some of the useful bulkheads between products and services that prevent one event from dragging the whole portfolio down. Now, in the short run, that means resilience and efficiency are antagonistic forces. They're at tension with each other. You trade one to get the other. But in the long run, the balance between these two is what creates growth. So it's not just a simple kind of growth either. It's a compound growth. The term autocatalysis comes from chemistry, where a byproduct of a reaction creates a catalyst. That means it accelerates its own reaction. And that kind of geometric growth is what characterizes modern business and suggests a kind of strange self-causing loop. So if I come back to Atlassian's unique business model, great products that should sell themselves. This understanding, this autocatalysis idea, gives us two ways to look at why that model works. Our products are resilient to disruption. There have been and will continue to be disruptive competitors. But Atlassian is resilient because of a low cost and a rich ecosystem. So both in our own products and the third parties through our marketplace and solution partners. Meanwhile, our efficiency is high. We've spent years removing friction from our website and our products so they're easy to try, buy, and use. Customers continue to perceive high value from that experience and the fundamental utility of our products. So where does that cycle begin? What's the cause? Well, it's a virtuous cycle that appears to cause itself, and that's the idea of autocatalysis. Okay, so after what might have felt like a bit of departure into the purely philosophical, I'll return to the practical and to my parallel to Castaway. So that last stretch was like the difficult journey off of the island, and now we're returned to reality and frankly a little bit of disappointment. So let's talk about what's after Agile and Lean IT, especially for managers. First, I think the trade-off between efficiency and resiliency is a challenge to the way that we've thought about things, especially for traditional software and IT. Where we've traditionally been characterized as a cost center, we're now driven to the extreme of efficiency. And now that we've started to earn a place as a value-creating part of the business, we need to look more closely at what that means. If we don't, Conway's law suggests that we'll be doomed to produce highly efficient software with no resiliency. And in this world of always-on services, that would be missing a critical aspect of what customers really want from their software. So I don't know, how many folks have heard of the Netflix Chaos Monkey? Yeah, oh, that's a wonderful number of people here. Okay, basically, Netflix wrote a bot that would randomly turn off their own servers. And the point is to make sure that the systems fail over gracefully and without human intervention. It's been some years now, so Netflix has continued to build out those kinds of checks against their system. There's a whole simian army of those things that test other aspects of resiliency in their systems. Now, the general approach has been labeled chaos engineering. It's definitely not efficient to attack your own production systems, but it does strike a very economical balance between efficiency and resiliency. The result, it's very rare to notice a full failure of Netflix. In fact, for most problems, it's just a stop and restart of your own clients. Okay, that's performance. Second, I think we have to get beyond the focus on specific practices and tools and thinking more about cultural propensities. Again, I'll call on Conway's law to make the point. This time by appealing to Conway's corollary, where if we reverse engineer an organizational communication pattern from the kinds of software that we want, well, what would that say? It would say that if we, for this, set of folks, if you kind of understand or desire to have continuous delivery, where we can deploy to production many times a day without sacrificing safety, usually by hiding new features behind a feature flag, then what we want to have is also an organizational implication, or what that implies is that we should also be able to have multiple ways of doing things and experimenting within our own organization, just like we have multiple code paths in production. So yes, there's complexity associated with that, but it's better than the alternative where we focus on an organization-wide Big Bang transformation. Third, I think we still need to turn to team-level innovation and then turn that innovation into organization-wide learning. To do that, we need to change how we capture most methods as a way of knowledge sharing. We need to reconsider the idea of processes and procedures. They're too often written as if they were for the simple domain, where it's all cause and effect. But when we consider the complicated, chaotic, or complex domains, we need things that account for the things that can go wrong. So I think there's an interesting quote I'll read in a second. I think it's an industry we've gotten a little bit caught up on the success of Agile and DevOps. I frequently hear people talking about the company's agile transformation, but I think in some ways that it's still injecting a little bit too much change for change's sake. So I love this Deming quote, don't just do something, stand there. Because I think it's eminently empirical. It means we should be studying the systems that we have before we start to modify them. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and open for questions. And if we've got maybe 1 minute left, we have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Oh, yeah. Let's give Ian a round of applause.
Oh, thank you.